Now, assuming your virtual machines, your containers run quite well, you are now good to determine, do you want to continue on Wildfly or do you want to continue on Docker? I'll give you a hint. We will kind of abandon the Wildfly machines more or less and continue to run on Docker. Specifically, when a little bit later down this course, we are going to configure a cluster. We have prepared the cluster exercise on Tomcat because it has the HA proxy as a load balancer and so on in it. But be my guest, if you want to configure the cluster on Wildfly or on any other server, then you can easily do so as well. Now, so far, all of the images, all of the Docker files that we have prepared for you had all of the configuration required. Or we gave you all of the steps to configure the Wildfly settings as we needed them. Big question is, how do you configure Liferay in a way that is, I would say, repeatable, or in a way that is advisable, or in a way that you can explore how to configure Liferay. And that's all part of the upcoming chapter named Configuring Liferay Settings. We have a few ways to configure Liferay. Those are largely two alternatives. I would say 2.5 alternatives maybe. The very first one, configuring the settings via the user interface. If you're going to Liferay's control panel, we didn't yet cover the user interface overall on Liferay. So just log in as the administrative user, then open control panel on the left side. So I'm logging in and I'm opening control panel here, configuration, and then system settings. This is what brings you to the Osgi system settings, so to say, which are an explorable interface just like this. Here it's way better to see than on the slide, or probably also in the handout in the books, where you have a lot of different configuration for many different components. We have system settings which are valid everywhere, and we have some instance settings that are available to a specific instance. Now, what is an instance? Bear with me, we're covering that later. Everything that you configure here will go into Liferay's database or into Liferay's Osgi folder. And then we have another variation or another way to configure Liferay, which is through so-called properties files. Now, this is something, well, both variations are variations that I like to give you as homework to explore. Probably the most boring homework is Portal Properties. This is a file that is around forever. My first contact with Liferay is right now, as we're recording this, about 10 years ago, 10 years and a few days. That was my very first contact with Liferay, and Portal Properties was around. Actually, back then, Control Panel was not around, so much of the configuration had to go through Portal Properties. Now, we're working hard on getting it smaller and smaller and getting less and less features into Portal Properties. It's still a file. Actually, I haven't checked the 7.1 version yet, but I think it's still north of 8,000 lines of length. Now, Portal Properties as a file is hidden deep within Liferay. In other words, if I tell you where it is, I think somewhere the slides or the book will tell you where it is, then you can extract it from Liferay, but I don't really want you to do so, because you're not supposed to change the file anyways. It is 8,000 lines of default values. Actually, it's not 8,000 lines of default values, it's 8,000 lines of values and documentation, which is the beauty of Portal Properties. That's why I love this file, even though it's so darn long. What you do instead is you create your own file named portal-ext.properties and place that in Liferay's home directory. Where is that? This is where your Docker file puts it. It's typically one directory up of your application server, whatever application server that is. That is Tomcat or JBoss or Wildfly. Now, Portal-ext or Portal-ext properties contains all of the values from portal properties that you want to explicitly change. In other words, portal properties is 8,000 lines long and you're not supposed to change them, but the 3 or 10 or 14 values of portal properties that you want to change go into this file. Then there's yet another one, portal setup wizard properties, which contains all of the values that the setup wizard writes. Now these files are completely under your control with one exception. Portal setup wizard .properties is written once by Liferay, namely when the setup wizard runs, and then never touched again. Well, it is read, touched and read, but never written. Liferay never writes these files apart from setup wizard exactly once. They're absolutely up to yourself. Whatever you change in the user interface goes into the database. Nothing through the user interface ends up in these files. And then for the Windows users and administrators among you, just be careful, I've seen it multiple times. Creating a new file, portal X properties with a standard Windows settings, be aware of this annoying habit of Windows not displaying all of the file endings. If you create portal X properties .text.txt, Windows will hide the .txt. It will look like portal X properties, but it's actually portal X properties.txt. And naturally, Liferay will have no clue what kind of file that is. It will not read the file. So for a DevOps system in Windows, I kind of assume you have the file endings there anyways, because why hide them? It's only a hindrance. If you commonly don't show your file endings, just be aware of this very easy trap that you can see. Now, when I told you don't open portal properties, oh, and by the way, here it is. There is a jar file and there's a portal properties in here, portal impl jar. If you find that, you can find portal properties. You can find it a lot easier in docs.liferay.com or on docs.liferay.com. And that is, if I open my browser, I have prepared it, docs.liferay.com, and then you can find all of the variations in here. For the benefit of the people here, I'm going to zoom into the URL. So docs.liferay.com, and then just browse through portal 7.1 latest, properties doc, and there you'll find portal.properties. And you find a variation of the file that is rendered for you to use, to read with clickable index. And let me go through a few things here, a lot of documentation, and then the actual values. This is homework for you. Take some time and read through these lines. It's a boring and an interesting read at the same time. There are so many things that I just found out about just because I know this file. So when you have browsed through, so don't read. You will fall asleep if you read it. And there are several sections that you can just skip over whole sections when they just are too technical. But there's a lot of gems in there to find. Let me go back here. When you find your portal setup wizard, you might look at it, you might want to look at it and see what it contains. One of the values it contains is don't run setup wizard. Basically, we did so for you, we did so on a different system, and then just pre-configured everything in a matching way. It says here, avoid modifying portal properties file at all costs, which means when you locate portal properties in this jar file and you extract it, use this extracted file to read, maybe to copy from, but then you only edit any of these files. When you edit, What Liferay does, as it says here, the read order for the properties is portal properties first, portal X properties next, and then portal setup wizard properties after that. That means anything that is set in portal setup wizard properties is read last and will overwrite everything else that was there before. It's just the regular read order. And I want to add one more setting. If you then configure something in the database on top of it, that's what goes even past portal properties. So Liferay might have different settings in the database. You can configure something in portal properties, portal X properties, and it might not get into effect because someone has configured a database setting with the same effect, and that always overrules portal properties. Less and less and less is portal properties actually being used. We go more to the default settings in OSGI in this user interface in system settings. Wait a second. And that is, well, where basically the future is. That's also quite well explorable on the user interface, where you can click through and see what you can configure. Quite often there's also just help text mentioned in there as well. There's a lot of default data in Liferay that you might want to be aware of. Some default data that we have here is mentioned: dynamic data lists, document and media, web content templates, application display templates. This is probably something that is more on the content list. So you as a system administrator don't need these kinds of data types, but just be aware when Liferay starts, it will populate the database on first start with a bunch of default settings. For example, the web content templates. They are always in there when you create a new database, and your content people will be able to change them. Now, configuring locales, we have a little exercise prepared for you a little bit later. Configuring locales, we kind of spoke about that with encoding, encoding and the different alphabets, but the locales are now the languages that Liferay is being shown in. We can have a default locale instance-wide, so whenever you log into your Liferay system and didn't say anything else, or even when you don't log in, there's a default language. Commonly English. Then you can have a site-wide, when you have just an intranet site on there, the internet site. You can have a accounting department site in Liferay, and that can have a different default language as well. If it's a French accounting department, why should they use English? You can make the French accounting standard language French. And then every individual user can configure Liferay's setup so that they are happy with just the presentation of the setup. Just to give you another example for that, Liferay's community site has largely English content. Well, the forums have other languages as well. I love configuring it in British English. Why? Another part of the locale, which is more than just the language, it's also just the formatting of the date. I'm coming from Europe, and month, day, year absolutely does not make any sense to me. Day, month, year makes all the sense to me. So I'm typically running in British English, even though the language is exactly the same. We don't do anything special for British English versus US English, but the date format is different and matches my own taste quite well. If only that actually makes me happy, and I've harassed the team enough so that they have enabled British English for me. I might be the only user. Now everybody knows, and who else is from Europe and irritated by those dates might configure it as well. Then it gets a good use and will continue to be supported on that site. Now, user settings take precedence over site settings take precedence over instance settings, but in the instance settings, you can configure which language can be used. Now, last time I looked, Liferay came with, I believe, more than 40 languages. Can anybody confirm, deny? It's like 40-ish languages, but only a few of them are enabled by default because not all of them are fully complete and fully QA'd. I think it's 6, 7, 8 languages that come by default as the standard language, and also the enterprise supported languages. If there is something wrong in there, we'll fix it under the contract. And everything else needs to be enabled explicitly. But it typically works quite well. We have some user pages that you can configure. I'm debating with myself if this is DevOps or if this is rather content side. Every single user can have their personal page. Pages, actually, public pages, private pages. So pages that are just a profile for every single user, and pages that are the dashboard that is just the personal information that only that user can see. By default, every user has them, has a dashboard, has a profile, and we can change that with some settings that actually belong on the DevOps side, just because they are there. And we can see that in the exercise when we, for example, deactivate a profile for a user because it's not quite used. The default profile in Liferay is actually empty. So why have it at all? We can easily disable that, and that's part of one of the upcoming exercises. And you can see the property here already. If you add this property with a false to your Portal X properties, then you will see that the profile for each user goes away. Now, before you do that, and you wonder why it doesn't work, we've now discussed 2 ways to configure Liferay. One is Portal Properties, and one is the system settings. When you change Portal Properties, you got to restart. Period. There is no way around it. Well, there is. The name is JRebel, but I've never seen that in production. I've seen it in development situations, but not in production. So after any change to Portal Properties, Portal X properties, whenever you want them to be in effect, restart. Which is so uncomfortable that actually it's advisable to use the system settings wherever possible. Now, there are 2 exercises. Let me see, 2, maybe 3 exercises actually now following, which is the settings via the user interface, where we change some modules. We'll deactivate the blogs module. This is one of the settings that we'll do for Osgi. We can also do so through a shell. Now, in our settings, in this setup, we have explicitly enabled GoGo shell from a telnet command. This is something that, I don't know if this is an English idiom as well. In German, we say, like, I get cold feet doing that. Does that translate? Not really? It's like I'm shuddering, I'm shivering when I hear this. So there's a telnet shell into my running server. It's very convenient. It's probably not anything that you want to have in your production system running. But it is available on the user interface on the web console anyways, so you can use it on the web if you don't enable it, and otherwise you can just connect with Telnet, which we have configured to be running on localhost only, so you can't just reach it through the network, but only if you are already on that machine. And you can deactivate the blogs module, for example, and double check on both ways that it's running. The other exercise, which is fully documented in the written material, is the language settings. When you go to the instance settings, set the default language to something that you hopefully recognize. Anybody here knowing a second language is on the winning end, because sooner or later you might want to change it back. I'll tell you a trick on how to change it back. You can set a different default language. As I said, the default is United States English. You can verify the language change, revert, and update time zone settings. What you do there is basically you can validate that on the user interface you see I'm creating an article and that has the right time and date, and your logs will show the time and date as well. Just make sure this is what you want. You may want it to see in your local time zone settings, in your local time zone, wherever the server is, if that makes sense to you. Otherwise, my recommendation is always have the server log in UTC time. Often that makes sense, but it's harder to explain to some people. Now, when you configure your language to be a different default language, and you don't speak that language, you might lock yourself out. Say, where do I find this option in this language to change the language back? Now, there's one trick. If you just go to your URL, you're now on localhost :8081, for example. If you go to that URL and you add a /en, the language code, then you will see the current user interface in English no matter what your configuration is. And then you can continue to click from there and find your installation, find your instance settings, and configure back. Last exercise here is the user settings. Actually, no, these are the language settings for the user. You can configure the language at site level, at user level, the time zone for the current user. Because what do I care where your server is and where your server is configured when I'm in a different part of the world? Then I care about my local time and not about the server's local time. That doesn't make any sense for me. So as a user, when I'm logged in, I typically just configure my own personal time zone, and suddenly I get all of the times and dates and stuff correct. And the last exercise in here is configuring the user site, configure the user's personal site, personal page, which is the profile, for example. You can configure them. All of these exercises are neatly laid out in the written material, so I don't go through the details here. I'll just tell you about these 3 exercises. For the video, we'll have separate screen shares if you need them. Otherwise, you can, of course, just go through the written material as well. And with that, after this, you will have had your very first tour through Liferay's configuration. And we can repeat that very quickly with our review, which says the simplest way, or I would actually say the most advisable way to configure Liferay is through the control panel, system settings in the user interface, so UI. That's the tiny little bit there in the back. They can also be configured through properties files, and the read order of these properties files is, just to make sure, it's first portal properties, the big one embedded in Liferay that you're not supposed to change.
Then
ext, portal ext properties, and then the setup wizard last. So setup wizard rules everything else.